So, Kev, it's time for This Week in Trading History.
Your favorite time.
Yeah, and so this week, what I wanted to do was I wanted to go to back to November 6th of 1928 when Hoover was elected President of the United States. And I thought this was so interesting. The first fact, what makes it relevant to the stock market, so we're not making this political, he goes on record as being the president who had the single worst performing stock market in his term. And it was down 80% on the Dow,
Come on,
uh,
really?
80% during the Great Depression. He was a one-term president, and from the when he was elected, by the time he came into office was sometime like in March because they waited a little bit longer for Coolidge to give the office over. But then the Great Depression started, and it was at the worst part of the Great Depression when he ended his presidency. And so I wanted to talk about just some of the interesting things about him being President of the United States, and particularly some interesting kind of things that line up with what we hear from Trump. And it's first of all, he was a very protectionist candidate. He put up tariffs. For instance, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930 basically saw tariffs on certain goods jump 50% because he was trying to, in a protectionist way, create jobs in the U.S. And he was elected. He came into office without ever having run for any elected office prior. He basically was a self-made millionaire as a mining engineer and basically ran as an incredibly popular candidate. He was a huge humanitarian. Most people don't know that during World War One, when the Germans isolated Belgium and there was a huge starvation, him as a citizen, as a millionaire citizen, actually put together the organizations to feed Belgium through for many years throughout the war. And so he was had a very good track record as a humanitarian, and he was incredibly popular. And he won the election by a landslide. And then in 1932, he lost the election by a landslide.
That's what 80% cut in the stock market does to you.
That's what it does. It's crazy,
Yeah.
but it's really interesting to kind of look at some of the tidbits of things that happened during his period as president, and and kind of to use an analogy, a lot of people compare him to like Trump running for presidency as a Republican, but it's very much like even if Bill Gates ran for president today, he was a very popular, a very rich person that basically gets into office. And back in the U.S. then, more than 50% of the nation was still rural, and 25% of the GDP of the United States was still based on agricultural products. And the agricultural depression, which started in the late 20s, was so severe during the Great Depression that things like wheat prices went from something like $4 a bushel to trading for a dime.
Come on.
Uh,
Really?
It was a complete collapse of
Uh,
commodity prices,
that's
complete
even worse
overproduction.
than the recent decline in wheat.
Exactly. And so i- he becomes president on this at the peak. So think of it: the stock market is still runs even 5 6 months later into his presidency was still running higher. He ran on this idea of prosperity for all, eliminating all poverty in the United States, and then the Great Depression hits, and at its worst part, we saw there was 25% unemployment. And what's interesting about that stat was that it was not just what you want to remember is that back in the 1920s and 30s, it was very uncommon. It was very rare for married women to work. And so when you're talking 25% unemployment, it was pretty much 25% of American households without any source of income.
Right. Which is just brutal.
It, it, it was an awful time during that Great Depression. And what's interesting is that the U.S. went from running a something like it was like a $1 billion budget surplus at the government level to running a deficit that was very close to something like 4% of its GDP. And he put in huge projects like the building of the Hoover Dam and other things like this that were projects that were put in motion, but it just wasn't enough. And it was interesting that during the Depression, he kept trying to be positive, and he kept saying the recession is over. We're in 60 days things will have turned, and every year it kept getting worse and worse. And what was particularly interesting is at the end of his term, when he lost to Roosevelt, the banking crisis was at its worst, and the banks across the United States were failing. And everyone was asking him to put on a bank holiday, but because he was already lost to Roosevelt, he didn't want his last action out of office being shutting down all the banks and calling a huge bank holiday. So he kept wanting Roosevelt to actually come on board with him to actually halt and stall the banks, and Roosevelt refused. He said, "If you don't have the balls to do this on your own, then I'm going to do it on my first day of office." And he basically, the banks were literally collapsing, and he chose to do nothing. And in the end, Roosevelt, the first action he did when he took office was make a national holiday and shut everything down. And so Hoover literally left office at the low.
Wow.
At the moment where and something like there were thousands of banks in the U.S. that failed in that period, and it's just like he ended his presidency at the trough, at the like literally everything just turned once Roosevelt came in.
Wow, that's unbelievable. I had no idea that was the case. That was Roosevelt's first course of action to
Yeah.
stop to declare a bank holiday.
It's and both Hoover and Roosevelt were both involved in Glass-Steagall coming into effect, separating investment banking from the money center banks and traditional banking. All of these things happened in that period, and it's amazing because he was a true Republican, a true entrepreneur. He was one of these people that truly believed that America can turn around this situation on its own, and it's just that negative feedback loop just during the Depression just kept feeding on itself, and they just couldn't turn it, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. Anyway, it is a really interesting story.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thanks for sharing that with us.